Today on Nova Legends podcast, I have General Vincent Brooks, one of the most distinguished and accomplished military leaders of our generation. General Brooks, his family goes way back with my family. It's such an honor with me to actually talk to him and meet him. General Brooks, thanks for doing this. Great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you, Julian. And we have many, many connections in our family, so it's good to be able to chat with you.
Yeah, it really is. Well, let me introduce you to people because we used to see you, every day during the Iraq War when you were doing the briefings.
Yeah.
My mother would call me up and say, hey, Vince is on TV every day. But let me remind folks a little bit. You're born in Alaska, of all places, but
Yes.
And you spent a lot of time in California. You're briefly in Northern Virginia at Thomas Jefferson High School. You played basketball for Dick Wickline there. Then
Yes.
you went back to California because your father, General Leo Brooks, got stationed outside of Sacramento, and you ended up graduating from high school in Jesuit high school. You went to West Point like your older brother, Leo Brooks, who also was a brigadier general. And while at West Point, you played for an obscure basketball coach named Mike Krzyzewski, which is very interesting. But you also you were the cadet brigade captain for 4,000 students. That was the first time African American has done that. You were in the first class of coeducation as well, so you had to deal with a lot of, I'm sure, challenges that came with the Army being respectful of all the issues that could come up. So you graduated from West Point. Eventually, you became the 8th African American to be a 4-star general, which is the highest rank in the Army, I believe. We don't have a 5-star anymore, do we?
That's right.
Yeah,
not anymore. No.
If I start talking about everything you've done, it's almost hard to believe. But you served in Kosovo. You were in Afghanistan, Iraq. You were doing the briefings, as I mentioned before. You were second in command with a surge. Incredibly prestigious appointment. You were commander of the 3rd Army, also the Pacific, the U.S. Army Pacific. You've 2 Bronze Stars, Defense Distinguished Service Medal. When you eventually retired in 2019, you had 650,000 troops under your command, American and South Korean. And then since then, you're vice chair of the Gary Sinise Foundation. You're visiting fellow at Harvard and Texas. I'm serving some boards, principal consultant of West XX Advisors. General, did I get most of that right?
Yeah, Julian, you did, I mean, with one exception. I actually spent a longer period of time in Northern Virginia than I spent anywhere else during my life. So we went, in my case, from 4th grade to 10th grade, and then I went to California for my last 2 years of high school.
Okay, great. Well,
Otherwise, actually, you were on target. Thank you.
Yeah, we're on target. In fact, probably more folks here will remember those early days. So I wanted. This is the beginning of the political season. Actually, we're in the middle of it now, and you've been in. I mean, if you could probably write a history book about military history, modern military history, because you've been everywhere. A lot of us worry that politics has taken over our foreign policy. There's no longer a bipartisanship in terms of foreign policy and also the military. When we think about those things, do we overblow those things? Have they always been that way? And it's always been people in the military like yourself that had to deal with that, or is it a real challenge? In the military and the politics around it.
Well, Julian, I think it has always been there. The military has a role to support the decisions that are made by politicians and to turn them into action in various forms, whether it's just representational action or combat action at the opposite extreme. There has always been a dimension of politics involved in that. I would say, though, I tend to agree with you that it's becoming more prevalent in recent years. Part of that is the onset of social media, onset of obviously televised media now for many generations. The ability to communicate opinion is much more widespread, and it's opinion without knowledge. And that tends to cause it to become more politically skewed than has been the case in the past. I mean, historically, foreign policy was a or at least bipartisan matter. for the national security of the United States. Now it's becoming very partisan. And that is dangerous. The impact of it is not so much on the military. The military is going to work for whoever's in charge at the time. But it's very, very difficult for the relationships that the United States has around the world. We are at once the indispensable partner and also the most unpredictable partner around the world. Even with our structures of alliances out there, there's still a question mark on which way will the wind blow for the United States in its internal politics, and how will that then manifest in foreign policy? So you're on target.
Yeah.
It's something to be concerned about.
Yeah, and you say concerned about it. Is it something that you really worry about? Is it something that needs to be addressed, or is it something that we just hope kind of works itself out?
So much of this is personality dependent, and so it will work itself out to a degree in the changing of personalities over time. But what becomes the question is, what becomes the practice of foreign policy? What does that begin to look like? And do we have more and more interventions of personality in policy, not politics, but policy? And yes, that does cause me concern. So what do you do about it? In my world, because the military works for the one who's in charge at a given point in time, elected by the American people, that's the one we always want to win, the one who wins. But we have to make sure that our military leaders understand the nature of the environment that they're working within, that their military actions, for example, are not benign. They may have political consequences or repercussions that in the past, maybe they didn't have to worry about as much. Yeah. But they have to be thoughtful about it now, not to become politicians. Absolutely do not. We do not want our generals and admirals to become politicians. That's not what we're talking about. But they need to be mindful of this political dimension that is entering into policy, and be thoughtful about what actions they take, what words they speak, what countries they visit. All these things become part of the equation. And it just means a greater degree of, I'll call it savviness, kind of, since a lot of your interviewees are athletes, it's floor savviness. You've got to understand what's happening around you in order to be most effective in your part of the game.
Yeah. Well, General Brooks, when my father, just to let people know the connection here. So my father, Joyce Brown, he was a lieutenant colonel. He was a fraternity brother of your father, Leo Brooks Sr., and they were at Virginia State together. My dad was actually a year before your father there. And then when they went to Vietnam, your father was my father's commanding officer in Vietnam. And then your father spoke at my father's retirement ceremony and also his funeral. So they go way back. Yes. My mother knows your mother, Naomi Lewis, Brooks, who had a school named after her in Alexandria, yes. Incredible educator. My mother and Miss Brooks were very good friends, our Army wives, and also very good friends of your sister Marquita. So we really go a long way back. But when my father used to talk about the old days, in 1953, he was from a town called Bedford, Virginia, a small town. 29th Infantry was actually from Bedford, the first to hit the beaches on Normandy. But it was a town between Lynchburg and Roanoke. And when he was coming up, a black man could only be a principal, a teacher, which is his father was both. Also a minister. His father was that also. A porter on the railway. There wasn't a lot of opportunity at the time in the small town. I guess in the big cities, it might have been a little bit different. I know your family was from Alexandria. Maybe there was more opportunity there. But the Army was a great opportunity for my father. And when Truman integrated the armed forces, and then there was a big push to have a lot more officers, African-American officers through ROTC and West Point and the academies as well. So it was a great opportunity. So there was actually no choice for my father but to be in the Army. You came along in a different time. You were in the Vietnam, the post-Vietnam years. It was a very politically charged time. But what about now? When you think about African Americans in the Army now, do you still see tremendous opportunity in the armed forces, and particularly the Army, or do you think the opportunities are everywhere now? It's a little bit different than it was obviously when our fathers chose and when you chose?
Well, I have to begin with gratitude to the generation of our fathers who grew up in a segregated America, wherever they happen to be. And both of our fathers were in Virginia. And Virginia had some staunch segregation for a very long time. The aftershocks of that were still in play by the time I got to attend schools in Fairfax County. A little bit less intense in Fairfax County than they were still in Alexandria City. But it was evident, nevertheless, that there was a slow change that had ongoing. The military, on the other hand, being under presidential directive authority, had an order given to them. Desegregation was the order. The culture didn't change as quickly as the paper gave the instruction to change, and it took generations to make progress. Many of the land grant colleges and universities, like Virginia State University, then Virginia State College, that our parents went to, all of them had ROTC programs for African American young men, and so there was an acculturation, if you will, through the universities that created a foundation for Black men to serve as military officers. At the same time, the culture of the military hadn't quite gotten to the point of full toleration of that reality, that there'd be more and more Black officers in positions of responsibility. And so the limitation on assignments began to impact how far a Black officer, usually from ROTC, sometimes from West Point, would be able to go. And so the rank of captain, the third officer grade, for the land forces, is where they usually ended up. It was very rare to find someone who went beyond that. So your father being lieutenant colonel, my father being a general, they both had extraordinary achievement for their generation. Now, to get to your question about the modern generation, I think about the roles of leadership that many who served in the military, whether it's generation before us, our generation, those who followed our generation, they gained leadership experiences that allow them to be impactful in communities, impactful in businesses. Many of them start their own businesses as entrepreneurs. They're investors. They're in everything. And as I heard Coach Lou Holtz say when we were speaking together a few years ago, he credits his experiences and his successes to his MBA. And so I first said, "Oh, that's interesting."
Yeah.
He said, "No, let me clarify. Made by Army." MBA. So his foundation is his military experience, and that absolutely applies to minorities as well. It's a foundational experience, whether you stay in for 3 years or 40 years. It's just a matter of the deepening of your ability to lead and inspire others and to be an exemplar wherever you go. How could you not advise someone to take that experience? And so I highly encourage military experience, and the benefits that come from that would be something that can impact lives. So it's life-changing, not life-stopping.
Yeah. I almost got there. I did 2 years of ROTC at UVA, and I didn't quite get over the hump. But let's go back a little bit. General Brooks, I didn't know you were actually born in Alaska, which is interesting. Did that impact your life at all? Did that have any effect on your life, the fact that you're born in Alaska?
Only in the difficulty of explaining where you're from when someone asks you that. From a functional perspective, no, it didn't have any impact because we left pretty early. I was a year or less of age when we departed. My brother and I both were born in Alaska. And as we often say, home is where the Army sends you.
Yeah.
And the young married couple of Leo Brooks and Naomi Lewis Brooks, that's where they got posted. So my father was doing an assignment with the 23rd Infantry Regiment, which at the time was helping to maintain the American frontier. So Alaska was not a state when I was born there, which tells you what the date is. So we were born in a territory of the United States.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I guess, but territory, you could still be president. So if you ever have those political ambitions, it's
you better ask my wife about that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I know you played for the great Dick Wickline,
Yes.
an amazing local coach at Thomas Jefferson. When did you guys first come to Northern Virginia?
In my fourth grade year, so that would have been 1968, I guess. Mm-hmm. And went to Bryn Mawr Elementary School in Bryn Mawr Park, which we were one of the original families to help integrate that neighborhood. and then went across the highway, across 95 as it was then, 395 into Holmes Intermediate School, Oliver Wendell Holmes Intermediate School. From there, the county was beginning to expand quite a bit. So some of the people from my junior high school at Holmes ended up going to this brand new high school called Robinson. Others went to Annandale, and then the rest of us went to Jefferson. So I moved on to Jefferson. At about that time, my parents moved where we live. We were in Bryn Mawr Park on one side of the highway, just off of Edsel Road. And we moved to the other side of the highway, right behind Thomas Jefferson High School, right off of Braddock Road. So that continued to be my school. I had friends that I'd grown up with now for several years. Very unusual for an Army kid to have friends and stay with them from third grade to fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th grade ultimately for me. So that's when we moved into the area, and that's how we grew up there. You know, my brother was an athlete also, and was a football player and a track athlete, and lettered at Thomas Jefferson, as well as lettered at Jesuit High School in California. And it was interesting to be able to really have to drop what you were doing, drop the reputation that you had created, drop the teamwork that you had become part of, and walk away from programs that were counting on you. So Coach Wickline had a young team, and he was building a team for the next 2 years, for the 75, 76 season and the 74, 75 seasons. And I was one of those. So I was fortunate that Coach Wickline really helped to bring talent out of me, allowed me to play on the varsity team as a sophomore. And there were several games I got in. Some of them I played pretty well, and other ones I was still learning a lot about the game. But he had enough trust and confidence in me to do that and play this young sophomore. And then I left, as one of my other teammates. So many of us in Fairfax County were military kids, or had parents who, for whatever reason, had mobility to move to other places right at the time that you're just beginning to crest. And so I finished my high school in California under Coach Lynn Stevens at a private Catholic school, as it turned out, that was a powerhouse in Northern California. So I was able to come into a very strong program, both academically and athletically, and thrive in both of those. And that is really what finished me in my preparation to go to West Point, academics and athletics. And it was a combination of those two that led to Coach K recruiting me.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to California, but I also want to get so my family settled, my father retired in 73. We'd already been, his last command was in DC. We settled in Lake Braddock. We were the first Black family in Lake Braddock.
Yes.
And we ended up going to Robinson. So some of those kids, you know, the boundaries there were fluid because they kept moving. They kept building new schools like Lake Braddock and Robinson. And
Lake Braddock came next.
Yeah, so things were changing quite quickly. Did you realize? I realized it was different, that I was one of the only Black families in the area. I knew it, but I didn't have a lot of perspective because I'm only, you know, I was only a 7, 8-year-old kid. But I knew things were different. But also people were generally very friendly to me. Because most of the people that lived in Lake Braddock were military people, government people. They were people that had been stationed in places where they knew African Americans as well. So I never felt out of place at wherever I was in Northern Virginia at the time. Not that we didn't experience racism, but it was generally a very happy a way to grow up. What about you at Jefferson? Did you realize right away that you were different, and these were historical times?
You know, one of the things I would say is that you're really describing what happens when you're a military kid. So you're already accustomed to being in an integrated society. And you didn't have a lack of expectation of being accepted, of being able to excel, and being able to fit in. That's what you had to do as a military kid, just as I did. So when we got to Jefferson, again, being from fourth grade up, I knew plenty of people. So I already had my crowd of friends that were also rising in their classes as well into Thomas Jefferson High School. So I had a group, and I didn't feel outside trying to fit in entirely. But at the same time, I do have to be honest and say that I felt different because I was a military kid. There were there were probably a good number of military families there, but the Black families who were in the school were kind of split. So people who were from the Lincolnia area, mainly right on the edge of Falls Church over toward Annandale, and Black military kids. And so assimilating there was actually more of a challenge. And it worked out. I had some great friends from those areas and found out half of them were my cousins. When it's all said and done, being from Northern Virginia, you might find more overlaps than you think.
Yeah.
But there was a challenge on being able to fit there, as well as fit into the broader community with mostly white students and mostly white teachers. The expectations of me, some teachers had high expectations of me and kept the pressure on me to perform, even if I was cutting up in class. Others had low expectations of me, and as many of us have experienced, would give guidance counseling saying, hey, you really just need to go get a vocational or technical job, because that's probably all that's waiting for you, which when that report would come home to my parents, they would go through the roofs and know that my child is in college preparatory focused courses. And they made sure that the school knew that that was where we were to be accepted in the group of people who were pursuing excellence. And so, yes, there was some awkwardness on fitting in, but at the same time, I felt like Thomas Jefferson was certainly my family. It was really hard to leave them.
Yeah. Well, it was a very exciting time for basketball in the DC area. The Baltimore Bullets were moving to DC. They were called the Capital Bullets right before, I guess, you left. University of Maryland, Lefty was building a program here. Terry Holland was just starting down at UVA. So basketball was obviously catching fire in the area. It was going to become a basketball city. Who were some of your earliest role models in basketball?
Well, there's one guy who played at West Springfield named Dave Kesters.
Yeah, I've interviewed him. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, he was a couple of years ahead of me, but his abilities on the court were really impressive. We played against, or I didn't get to play against him, but went to observe at the state championship, Moses Malone at the time. So he was 1 or 2 years, I guess 2 years ahead of me. So when they won the state championship, I was at that game, which was at your old alma mater, UVA. That's where the actual championship game was played. And that was a very different kind of basketball player in terms of the skill sets and the really advanced capabilities that he had, the approach to the game, the types of shots he could take, the positions he held on the floor. The game was changing. The speed was changing. People were getting taller and more agile. I'm 6'4". At the time, I was about 6'2", 6'3", and growing, and played forward. Nowadays, I'm way too small to be a guard. Way too small. So you've seen this continue to flow over time. The nature of the athletes, the athleticism and the size that comes with that athleticism was changing during that period of time. Those are just a couple examples that come to my mind right off the top.
Yeah. Well, Coach Wickline, who coached for many years at TJ, I think he was also with the St. Stephen's after he retired from the county, and also at West Springfield. Just an amazing legacy. He played at Falls Church High School as well. He was a good player. What do you remember about him as a coach? One thing I've been told, he was a stickler for details as a coach. But what about you? What do you remember about Coach Wickline?
Yeah, he was a stickler for details. He was focused. He knew his players. He knew how to challenge us to go to the next level of performance. He was technically very competent. So he knew the game of basketball and knew how to bring a team together to get the best out of them. He invested in us. He was also a teacher.
Yeah.
So I never had him in class, as it turned out, but certainly had him as my coach. So he was an excellent coach. Yeah.
So you end up going to we mentioned earlier, outside of Sacramento, in a town called Carmichael, which I guess is pretty close.
It's a suburb of Sacramento. Yes.
Yeah, and you end up going to a private school. Was that a big adjustment, going to an all boys private school after going to a co-ed public TJ?
Oh yeah. So it was good that I was a military kid. So I've been uprooted and replanted enough times to be able to adapt. But there was a culture shock, to be sure. East Coast and West Coast cultures are not the same. Yeah. Even the language we use. They'd say, hey, to get to Jesuit, come out of this place, get on Fruit Ridge Road, and go to the freeway. Oh, the what? Freeway. And so I'm used to Shirley Highway. I don't know what a freeway is. Yeah. And so we had a linguistic difference, a terminology difference that was not difficult to overcome, but it was part of the culture shock. California thinks differently than Virginia. You know, I always had there was always the backdrop of the racism of Virginia was always in my mind when I lived in Virginia. The history that I had been taught in elementary and junior high school was very racist history. There's no question about it. And that just wasn't part of the equation in California. Got along very differently from the outset and didn't have that always in the backdrop of whether it's okay for me to date their sister or not. And so that was also something to get used to, that I needed to let go of that. I need to let go of that expectation and then incorporate with my teammates in a much closer way. And I'm very, very dear friends from that high school. But then moreover, we'd gone from, I think at the time it was the top public school system in the country, Fairfax County Public Schools, to one of the worst public school systems in the country, Sacramento City Public Schools, because I would have fallen inside of the city based on where we lived. And my parents, having put us on that college preparatory track, knew that that was the aiming point. And so that's what drove us to a private Catholic all-boys high school. There were two of them in the city of Sacramento, and this was the pinnacle of the two, the more prestigious, harder to get in, a whole lot more expensive. And they made that investment in us, and it made a big difference in our lives. They also had a tremendous athletic program, as I said. State champions in a number of areas, Northern California champions in most other areas, some tremendous athletes in a very, very small school. We only had 600 students. It was a very, very small school.
Yeah, I believe a famous quarterback that was drafted in '84, that the draft of O'Brien, was it Ken O'Brien, was also at your high school. I don't know if he played basketball, but a famous I think it's Ken O'Brien. Was it the same culture for basketball as it was? Northern Virginia had incredible coaches. Wickline, you mentioned West Springfield and Kester's the coach was Don McCool. There were great coaches and programs all over Northern Virginia. Did you find the basketball culture the same?
Yes, it was more diffuse. So it was spread out. So in Northern Virginia, you go a few miles and you're into another school district. So, you know, going from, in those days, from Groveton to Mount Vernon to Fort Hunt to right around the corner there, you just run into all of them. And the same thing with Jefferson and Annandale and Robinson and Lake Braddock and West Springfield. That's a cluster that you just move through very, very easily and quickly. California was more spread out, at least the way our league was structured. So we were called the Golden Empire League, and it covered a very large area. But it had schools like Elk Grove High School. And Elk Grove doesn't sound like much, but if you associate the name Bill Cartwright with it, then Elk Grove was put on the map by Bill Cartwright. And we did play against him in a tournament of champions. And so it's very much like the Moses Malone experience from just 2 years before. Now Bill Cartwright is out there and following in the same pattern. The Catholic schools also competed throughout the state, and those were powerhouses in every place. So ours in Sacramento, several schools in the San Francisco Bay Area, some schools in the San Jose area, and several schools in the Los Angeles area, and we competed in a all-Catholic tournament, and the talent and athleticism was amazing. Many of those went on to play college basketball. Yeah.
Also, you're a 1976 graduate of Jesuit, and in the early 70s, there was a fatigue with the Vietnam War, and we experienced some backlash. The people that were serving in the military for the first time, probably since before World War I. So it was a very interesting time, kind of an anti-war type of feeling. So this is the time that you and your brother are deciding to go to West Point and to carry on your father's tremendous legacy. Did you think deeply? Obviously you did, but what were your thought process about going to West Point and a career in the military?
Well, when I was in Virginia, that's when all this was really reaching its crest, the 72 to 74 period of time. And it was frustrating for me and for my brother and for the other military kids whose fathers were in Vietnam, to have people protesting about them. My father's last tour to Vietnam happened when I was in my 7th grade year. But the fact that he was a Vietnam veteran and people were talking about Vietnam as though they were experts on it, mostly in a negative context. So students tend to be like that. But I had several teachers at Jefferson who were Korean War and Vietnam War veterans. They were very different, by the way. So I remember there was a a clear generational difference in just how they approach things. The Korean War veteran, for example, was one of my math instructors. As it turns out, he was a West Point graduate. That didn't make sense to me at the time, but it's a fact that he was. And he was from like the class of 1945 at West Point. So he wore a necktie to class every single day and that sort of thing. It's very structured about how the class went, but was an excellent teacher. And then I had another teacher for social studies who came in during my sophomore year. He had just gotten out of the Army. We knew that he'd just gotten out of the Army, and he'd been in Vietnam for a number of years. And he had this long hair and a big mustache. And as it turns out, he was a 1966 graduate of West Point. Mm. And that didn't make sense to me at the time. I mean, I knew what West Point was, but it didn't have any meaning for me in terms of, I could ultimately end up going there. I had no sense of that at all. I was somewhere between the two of them. I had affection for both of them, but I was probably more drawn to the 66 West Point graduate and the views that he had. He had a little bit of a negativism about his experiences in Vietnam, which is what led him to get out. And so that was probably more in my mind. There was also the personal resentment that I carried of that place took my father away 2 times. And thankfully, thank God he came back on both occasions. But I remember the pain of him being gone, deep pain that I felt when he was gone, especially the second time when I was in 7th grade, and how painful that was to me emotionally every single day. And so, going through that experience made me actually resent the military, not want to join it. Once I got to California, though, that began to change. And I started to feel a different affection toward the military and a greater understanding of what it was that my father was doing. We were in closer proximity. In Virginia, he was at the Pentagon a lot of that time. And I had some idea what he was doing, but I didn't really experience that with him. But in Sacramento, the place where I lived was the installation he commanded, the Sacramento Army Depot. And I could see how people interacted with him, the respect and admiration that they had for him, the way he led people. And it was a practical laboratory for me on human interaction and on leadership. And that began to inspire me. And so while I was slow to come to the choice of going to the military, I was going to be a doctor. I had always been focused on being a doctor. My nickname in Virginia was Dr. Vix, because I played a little bit like Julius Erving. Small guy who could get it in the air. But Dr. Vix and his bag of tricks was the nickname that I had. And that carried out into California. So the doctor part was always about part of the basketball, but also the fact that I was very much oriented on medicine. And it wasn't until late in my junior year and early senior year that I decided maybe I want to be a doctor in the Army. And I started asking around about that. And then that shifted to, I want to be an Army doctor. The priority was on being in the Army. Then my brother went to West Point and came back 6 months later, a very different young man. He was already a squared away young man, but he came back even more squared away. And it really impressed me. I said, I think that's where I want to go. Yeah. And part of it was, chasing my big brother, but it was also, there was something about it that had an attraction for me. And it was personal at that point in time. It was an officer from Northern Virginia, African-American officer, who was sent out to recruit. And he came to our house in California. And he brought the interest of West Point to us. And that changed the game for both of us. We still know him today. Joe Briggs is his name. He lives in Northern Virginia. As far as I'm concerned, he's a Northern Virginia legend, as well as Alfred Street Baptist Church, and a great friend of the family. But that's what drew us in that direction. And my brother was courageous enough to go to see Coach K and said, here, my brother's a freshman at West Point in a very hierarchical culture. And he is a track athlete, but he goes to the basketball coach and says, Coach, my brother is a basketball player and he wants to come to West Point. This is like, almost through the first semester of my senior year in high school. So I'm very late to apply. And Coach K hears him out and says, okay, is he any good? Yeah, I think he is. Now, of course, there's an honor code up there. You can't lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate anything who does. So I appreciate my brother telling the truth. He told the truth. His brother was good. It's gotten better. As I went from Virginia to California, my game matured quite a bit. I personally matured and became a bit more skillful, and sent him a video. At the time, it was a reel, a video reel. He looked at it and then called our house in California. It made a personal connection and said, I'd like to see if you can come to West Point, get your application in, do the following things. Yeah. And so I had 2 applications flowing at the same time. One was a normal application. The other one was a recruited athlete application. And one of them came back rejected. The other one came back approved. I think it was the recruited athlete one that came back approved. They were literally just a week apart, going to the same class. And thankfully, I was able to enter.
So you may not have gotten into West Point. If not for Coach K, you might not have gotten into West Point.
I would have at least had to try another year, at least, if I would have ever gotten in.
Yeah. I do want to go back quickly. When you were talking about moving to California, I remember a story my father told. In 1970, he went back, or 71, 70, he went back to Vietnam for another year. He didn't have to, but his men were going back and he felt obligated to go back. Yes. And then years later, I asked him, when I'm old enough, when I have kids and we could talk about these things, how could you go back when you had young kids and they weren't making you go back? And he said something that was really hard for me to understand, but he said, 1966, 1965, I would drive through Fairfax and there was nowhere for me to stay. There's no hotel. If I wanted to eat dinner, I had to be creative about where I go before. When I went to Vietnam, I was an officer. I was the man. So even though in Vietnam there was people were dying, it was serious. From my point of view, I had a lot of cachet over there. So it's one of those things that it was tough for me not to go back. My men were there. Plus, I was different there. I was treated better in Vietnam than I was in Virginia in the mid-60s. Now, things had changed by 1970, 1971. They were changing. But when we had that conversation, it was really interesting. And this is when I was much older. He couldn't have explained this to me when I was 5 years old, but because he left the day after Christmas and to go back to Vietnam. Well, anyway, that's my father, my mother, and my father. I should get my mother on the podcast at some time to talk about that. But let's go back to you going to West Point. Now, you go to West Point at a very exciting time. This is a time where women were first going to be plebes, or I believe you call them plebes.
Yes. That's right.
Yeah, and if you were going to go through the first 4 classes to go through. Now, that's got to be easier said than done. There's a lot of sensitivities, and with women there and men talking to women, dealing with women. That had to be a very exciting but yet challenging time to be at West Point.
Oh, it was, and it wasn't just with the integration of women. That was a monumental challenge unto itself. But we were also on the heels of an honor scandal that had rocked West Point's honor code just a few months before. So the class that would be the seniors for me as I came in as a freshman, when they were juniors, had been involved in an electrical engineering examination that was not, the information was not to be shared, and it was. They found out that it was widespread. So suddenly you have this upheaval that's happening inside of the Corps Cadets, where the foundational principle of the honor code, a cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do, has suddenly begun to shake and crumble. And it's under great duress. So that's happening at the same time that these young men and women are entering for the first time. The academy is trying to figure out what do you need to do to accommodate women. And so in many ways, they were being treated like lab rats. We were getting examined all the time. They were being examined all the time. There were physical exams, there were emotional exams, all sorts of things that are happening to them as they're West Point's trying to get it right, but probably oversteering in many ways the things that were needed. What kind of haircut should a female have? We know what kind of haircuts men get. Just buzz it off on the first day. What are your questions? No facial hair, none of that sort of thing. That's part of the code. And you stay inside of that standard thereafter. You might let your top grow a little bit further, but your sides are going to be clean, your back, your neck going to be clean all the time. And you're inspected multiple times a day. Mm-hmm. Inspected. So what about the women? What does it take to make a military female warrior? And we didn't know. We had a women's auxiliary corps at the time, but they were trained in many cases separate from men. So what does it take to train women with men? And so they had very short haircuts, for example. The uniforms were cut in a way that was better for men than it was for women in terms of the shape. It wasn't very flattering for them. And the women were able, through these interventions of faculty and examiners who were up there, to give feedback. Hey, you know, the way this uniform is cut, it's really screwed up. This makes me look terrible. I can't command a military appearance if I'm being ridiculed the way this thing is cut. And that was happening. They were being ridiculed because of the way the uniform fit them. And so there were adjustments that were made over time. In a couple of years, in 2026, we'll celebrate 50 years, a half a century of women at West Point. And the accomplishments that have happened since then have been absolutely remarkable. But for the pioneer women in my class, you know, they blazed the trail for all of the success that has come then. And I was honored to be with them as they went through it. Not entirely an ally at the beginning. Honestly, I had taken the party line. They shouldn't be here. Women can't do these sorts of things. West Point's for producing combat officers, and they're not allowed to be in combat. I had taken the party line for the first few months that I was there, and then learned over time they were going through as much as I was going through and then some. And my desire for my own acceptance needed to be outweighed by being a better teammate, being a better partner with the women in my class. And that's how it went for the rest of my 3 years.
Yeah, in general, I would think with the women, and also you being the first African-American cadet brigade captain, you were probably dealing with a lot of issues with race and also and gender that were never had really been a factor before at West Point.
It was an adventurous time. So the senior year was an adventurous time in terms of race, gender, and just where West Point was. We'd gotten a bit past. We'd gotten over the honor scandal. We'd reestablished that. There'd been studies and commissions that were made to evaluate the curriculum at West Point, the experience at West Point, and restructure it. So West Point has now been restructured. This is a new version of West Point that emerges in about the 1978 timeframe, after all the different hearings and different panels and different commissions have completed their reports. So 78 to 80, you see a very different West Point. How we approach women, you know, the body style of the women that we're actually recruiting, who tend to perform the best, began to change. Much smaller frames as opposed to much larger masculine frames. The opportunities for them to move into leadership positions are now emerging, and certainly by my senior year, we are now the leaders of the Corps Cadets. So men and women are moved into key leader positions. And there was some ridicule. Well, they're getting this because of XYZ, whatever concern somebody has that other than merit, the presumption of an absence of merit. And then I get named as the cadet brigade commander or first captain. This is a position that had been held by people like Robert E. Lee,
wow,
Douglas MacArthur, Jonathan Wainwright, William Westmoreland. I mean, it's names like these that have been exemplars in military history. And now I'm in this position, and I'm the first African American to do this. So that's added on top of all these other matters that were in high energy at that point in time. We had some superb officer leadership at West Point at the time. The ones who were anti-women, or the ones who were anti-African American, and there were some of both. Those had largely been weeded out, and we had a very different staff and faculty there that were true exemplars in how to make this kind of thing work. And chief among them, I don't want to make this comment too long, but chief among them, and the one who I'm most inspired by, is the person who was the superintendent. This is like the president of the university. And that's General Andrew J. Goodpaster. Andrew J. Goodpaster. He was from the class of 1939. Interestingly, he replaced the person who was from the class of 43. So we went backwards in time to an earlier generation, a pre-World War II class, to come in and now reset the U.S. Military Academy on its footing, a better footing. He'd been in there for 2 years at that point in time, part of that 78 period of time I told you about when he first came in. and was had been a 4-star general himself, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, the topmost military command we have in the world, one that Dwight Eisenhower previously had, and was a known soldier statesman and a true gentleman. And he came back on active duty out of retirement, took a reduction in grade from 4-star to 3-star, which says a lot about his humility and his sense of service, and then put West Point on track for the next 5 years. Well, he is the one who really approved my selection for that position, and gave me a lot of empowerment when I asked him one day, General, am I a token? Is this just one more token that's been added to the class of 1980? And he kind of chuckled in his gentlemanly and grandfatherly way. He says, no, if this is a very conservative institution. It doesn't like change. And if you weren't the right person, we would not have taken this risk. Yeah. And that was a degree of empowerment which I will never forget, and really set me on my path to go ahead and lead the full Corps of Cadets. Yes, there were racist issues that happened. I started getting a lot of fan mail. So when you get into the media, people think they know you, and then begin to respond as if they do. So there were letters that came. Many of them, most of them, were very supportive letters coming from all over the country, all over the world. Some of them were hostile. And among those hostile were ones that were very clearly either from West Point graduates or people at West Point with me. And you could tell by some of the language that was used, things that were not included, words that were not included in the news releases were included in these letters. And it meant it was an insider. It was someone who had been in the Corps of Cadets or was in the Corps of Cadets. And so I was not without some degree of resistance and hostility, but for the most part, I was supported in my effort of leadership.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned West Point as a conservative institution. What effect did the politics of the day have on your experience at West Point? Now, Nixon resigned in shame. Gerald Ford, an American hero, took his place, but he's beaten by Carter. And Carter was an outsider. He was a very different type of politician to become president. What was the political mood like in the country, and how did that affect your experience at West Point?
It was a challenging political mood. The degree of trust and leadership had been eroded. Many among the staff and faculty, again, we had multiple generations. So the dean of the academic board, for example, was a World War II veteran. Okay. Some of the staff and faculty, the older ones, the department heads, were Korean War veterans. And there were a few World War II veterans among them. The rotational faculty, people who come for 3 years and then return back out into the Army, at the time they were all Army officers, were Vietnam veterans. And so that same generational difference I alluded to at Thomas Jefferson High School was playing out at West Point. Many of them were the contemporaries of that social studies professor, instructor I had at Thomas Jefferson High School, who had negative experiences with leadership in a very negative political environment where they were called baby killers, et cetera. And we were feeling all of that. We felt their frustration in terms of what they tried to communicate to us on what was important, how to work through that. I remember my first Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. We had some questions about whether we should or should not wear uniforms. The decision was we're going to wear the uniforms. We're going to represent ourselves downtown. So after the game, we were free to move around for a period of time. But there were people who were hecklers when they saw someone in uniform. That was still ongoing. So our society was still healing, or maybe another way to say it, our society was still injured and ready to heal. That changed over time, to be sure, but we felt all of that. And then, as you mentioned, as President Carter came in, his view of what military service should be. The good news was he was an academy graduate, so he was a Naval Academy graduate. So he had some idea of what the service academies were, but what the role of the United States was in the globe and how the military instrument was to be used was in debate, and best exemplified by his statements to reduce the number of forces in Korea by half within 2 years when he went over to visit. And that still reverberated all the way up to my time commanding in Korea from 2016 to 2018. That was not forgotten. And so we felt these kinds of perturbations even then as cadets, and it shaped us. It shaped us in many ways to One, hang on to the bedrock, hang on to the principles of duty, honor, and country, even if your country's angry with you. It's the country that you think about, not your emotion. The idea of selflessness, the idea of honor and integrity. These things were deeply imbued into all of us, and that's what we carried through our career. And I would say that I was fortunate to be part of the generation that turned things back around. So to go from a 1976 Army to a 2004, 2006 Army, these were almost two different worlds in terms of the degree of professionalism, the skill sets, the affection of our fellow citizens. But there was a turnaround that happened to make that happen from the 1980s and early 1990s. And I was honored to be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to that incredible military career in a second, but I did want to ask one more question about Coach K. So, I can't resist asking you, could you have any idea that he was going to become the Coach K that was incredibly successful, win all the titles? You knew him as a very young coach. Even when he got hired at Duke, everyone was like, who is this guy? In his first couple of years, he almost got fired at Duke. So all that what came after may not have happened. What were your impressions of him? And is there any way that you could have predicted that he'd have such incredible success?
Well, there was no question that he had talent as a coach, immense talent, because he didn't have highly talented players. West Point had been losing a lot of games. Coach K came in 2 years before I got there. And by the time I was there, we went 20-8. We didn't have any seniors. We were playing against the likes of Dave Corzine at DePaul. I mean, these are the people who were on a schedule. It wasn't a pansy schedule.
Yeah.
Playing all through what was at the time the Eastern Athletic Conference, I guess is what it was. We ended up winning some tournaments. We beat Florida State at the Vermont Classic, and I was honored to be able to play in that game. And we didn't have any seniors. So we had an All-American junior who was really the leader of the team, and I was behind him. He was about 6'5", but played like he was 6'9", and he was a heavyweight. So he was very, very strong, and I was his punching bag at practice. So I played behind him, and if he got into foul trouble, then I would get into the game. So I didn't play much my freshman year, but I was a part of that 20-8 team to be sure. But honestly, to bring that kind of success out of a team that has as little talent as we did, I love them all. I mean, I had some great teammates, but we weren't superstars. Nobody from there went to the NBA. His ability to create a cohesive team, any player that you've ever had from Coach K, probably when you interviewed Grant Hill, he talked about this. Coach K talks about the 5 fingers. You got to bring the fingers together like this. The power you get when all 5 are joined together and working together, that is the mantra for everyone who ever played for Coach K. And that is Coach K. And it's also his degree of investment in his players that was unlike anything I ever experienced, and it made a difference in my life. And I'm so grateful to him for that. He asked me to come down and speak at the Coach K Fuqua Business School a few years ago. And I talked about leadership, and I had to naturally give honor to him because he impacted me through his leadership, not just his coaching. So he was fantastic. I'm not surprised he ended up being the most winning coach in all of American history. By the way, for those first 3.5, 4 years, he had exactly the same coaching staff that he had at West Point.
Yeah.
Down to and including what we call the officer representative. So every team has an officer representative from the academic department to kind of run interface and help the athletes make sure they stay on their academic game. Even that person went to Duke with him.
Yeah.
So it was that same West Point coaching staff that ended up going to the national championship in his 3rd year.
Wow.
First 2 years, it was dangerous, but 3rd year. And then he began to create the engine of attracting the best talent in America to come with the best coach in America. And it's no wonder it ended up the way it did.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's amazing and not surprising at all. I'm so glad you guys have kept in touch. Two great leaders. So, in your military career, and I mentioned this earlier, you've been at almost all the hot spots. You were in Kosovo, you've been in Korea, of course, you were in the Iraq War, you're in the Afghanistan War. And one thing about our foreign policy, everything changed dramatically with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and when communism went away, because before that, our foreign policy, I'm not saying it made sense because it's never easy, but you always knew who was on the other side. But afterwards, foreign policy got very complicated, and it still is today. Do I have that right? In that, in all these situations that you were involved in, that we were involved in, it was always very tough to get ourselves involved. Why are we here? And sometimes we didn't know who was on our side and who's not on our side.
Well, the Cold War was characterized by a bipolar world. And so that's where our concentration was. And perhaps myopically, because the rest of the world still had hotspots and bonfires that were ongoing that ultimately became what we were involved in after the Cold War ended. So we can fall into a strategic myopia where we only see a monopolar threat. And that's what we had done with the Cold War. Everything we saw was in the context of what the Soviet Union was doing and its influences, its satellites, its adherents around the world, its ideologues. Everything was against that. And then it collapsed. Up to that point in time, though, trying to maintain a ready force, the question was often asked, ready for what? Because our purpose is to deter. So why are you sharpening your sword for combat? And getting the resources that were needed to be ready for the worst case scenario, which is it goes bad, it goes sideways. We, for whatever reason, spill over the brink, was always a challenge. Thereafter, once the Soviet Union collapsed, interestingly, the same question comes up. What are you sharpening your sword for? The Soviet Union has collapsed. We're now the sole unipower. Why are you doing this? And of course, having grown up with an athletic background, you know why. When you're number one, everybody's after you. Everyone is after you. And any given night, you're finished. And when will that be okay for the United States military to be defeated around the world? It's never going to be okay. So you have to always maintain a readiness for what comes next. I learned from that period of time to always anticipate what is coming next. Yes, I've got to be ready for what's ongoing, but I must anticipate what is coming next and posture my organization, posture policy, posture whatever it is that's needed for what might be emerging next. And that's what I ultimately ended up doing for about my last 17 to 20 years of the military.
Yeah. Well, one of the commands that you had, it got you a high exposure, was when you did the daily briefing during the Iraq War. As I said before, my mother would call me every day, say, Vince is on TV, I'd watch it. You did such a tremendous job. That's got to be a tough job. Do we cover, does the media do a fair job in covering the military and covering wars? And I mean, obviously the military and the media's interests don't always align. I mean, the media's job is not to give the armed forces a message necessarily. Their job is to give the news. But in general, does the media do a good job of covering these wars?
That was an experience, and with lessons learned that I could go on for hours about what I gathered out of that. But let me just try to be direct about it. They try their best to cover wars accurately and cover the military accurately. They try their best. I honestly believe that. And at the same time, they fall way short. Now, why is that? Well, first, the objectives are different. Journalists, especially true journalists, the ones who are not doing something for political bent or agenda or for profit, but are really about trying to expose as much of the truth to the public as possible. And that's my hasty definition of a true journalist. Their desire is to get the whole truth. But I, as a government official, particularly as a spokesperson, have to protect certain parts of the truth from public viewing, from public understanding. That sometimes causes people to go, no, you're hiding secrets from us. Yes, if I don't, your kids get killed. Do not be precise about where the attacking force of the 3rd Infantry Division or the 1st Marine Division are located exactly, especially when I know through intelligence that I'm receiving that the Iraqis don't know where we are either. Why would I be precise in saying, no, your reports are that we're here. We're actually another 40 miles further in, and we're about to hit the flank of this Republican Guard division, and they don't know it. They're oriented in a different direction. It's going to be a slaughter. We're going to be killing a lot of people here in the next 24 hours. Stay tuned. Now, if I say that, what happens? It was very clear from that experience that the Iraqis were watching the news updates or the operations updates that we were giving. And they began to put their own person out there who was a mirror reflection of me, nicknamed Baghdad Bob.
Yeah.
But, you know, Mohammed Saeed al-Shahaf was the person who was the spokesperson for the Iraqi regime because they had to get into the information space. The media tends to try to balance those two points of view. And in doing so, they make a critical mistake.
Yeah.
Because if I'm telling the truth, and I always told the truth, but I didn't tell the whole truth, I'll admit to that. There were things that I hid from the public for national security reasons, for operational security reasons, not because of embarrassment. You know, we always revealed the stuff we were embarrassed about. But when you're trying to maintain operational security, or protecting an operation while it's ongoing, it's not the whole truth. And I acknowledge that. But Mohammed al-Sahaf was deliberately spewing utter lies. Nowhere close to Baghdad. We crushed them under our boots. Crushed them at the gates. In fact, we're sitting on Baghdad International Airport. He's telling a falsehood. I'm telling the truth, but not the whole truth. And if people think that the difference or the truth is somewhere between those two, they are always skewing toward the lie. So any attempt to balance, which the media often does, especially in military reporting, always provides advantage to the liar. And the U.S. is held to a higher account than our adversaries. They can lie all they want about what's going on. Journalists, if they're really doing their job, are pursuing the last part of the truth that has not been revealed, not balancing. So the truth is somewhere further than what has been said, not somewhere between what has been said. Yeah. That's just my view. They try. The second reason is the military doesn't provide enough access. It provides access, it doesn't provide context. You know, let me just give you a short vignette here, and I'll make it short.
Take your time.
If you and I were to walk into, and we're not orthopedic surgeons, if we were to walk into an open hip surgery and we're given permission to observe it, as long as we didn't touch anything, you know, so we masked up, we cleaned up, gowned up, stand on the side and look, you describe what it is you're seeing with accuracy? Yes, absolutely. You can talk about the sights, the sounds, the smells, whether there is or isn't blood when the incision occurs, how long the incision was, what happens when the hip joint is dislocated. You can be very precise about it and accurate. Now, is it going well or not? Context to be able to say whether the surgical team is working cohesively or not. We don't have the context or the knowledge to be able to say, this is a really good surgery, is going extremely well. We can't say that. We have to have someone who has expert knowledge to put it into context for us. And when the military fails to do that, it causes journalists to report with inaccuracy. So this is a two-part responsibility. Journalists to do the right thing and pursue the rest of the truth, and the military to provide access and context so that it can be properly and accurately reported.
Yeah. So it's kind of almost a natural disconnect there that's hard to.
There is, but both sides have to work it. They have to work toward each other, not work against each other.
Yeah. Well, General Brooks, I'm a lifelong liberal, and I have to say, George W. Bush was a complicated guy because I was always suspicious of him. But one thing I would say, he had Colin Powell as his Secretary of State. He had Condoleezza Rice as his security advisor. You weren't a political appointee, but African Americans were prominent in his administration. Was that lost on you? That had to be. It had to make you feel good about Bush. Not that he was giving people opportunities that didn't deserve it, but he had great African Americans in leadership positions throughout his administration.
So given those data points, I have to ask you, why do you not trust him? Now, you don't have to answer that. Yeah. Why do you not trust him? So we have to get over, I think, ideological implications when you find evidence that says there's more to it. Yeah. And yes, there are plenty of policies that you could disagree with, plenty of decisions that he made that you can disagree with, although he made decisions. And I'm not trying to advocate for them one way or another, but it certainly was not lost on me that I was part of that. So I'm not an administration official when I'm doing the spokesperson role. I'm a military official speaking on behalf of the military command, but that information is being used by the White House. Okay, they made reference to it in their briefings at different parts of the day. It did make it to the president. I know that for a fact, having met him after it was all said and done. He says, "Good job, Brooksy." So he knew what was going on, that I was contributing to what it is the administration was doing, good or bad. That was my duty to do that, and that's what I tried to do. And so, yes, it was not lost on me. After that period, ended up moving to a different position that was perhaps even more visible inside of government, not visible to the public, as the Joint Staff Coordinator for the War on Terrorism, and found myself sitting in West Wing briefings where there's only a few of us in the room, and it's all the people you just named, and I'm among them. I was a fairly junior officer at that point in time, and that was almost breathtaking to know that you're in that level of decision making and not mess it up. So it didn't fail to hit me that many of these were African Americans, and each administration since then has also had representation, and each administration since then can give you plenty of things to be frustrated about or to be happy about. I think that's just the nature of politics.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wasn't trying to take a shot at Bush personally. I just meant
I'm just
policy, but
that's all right.
So I did want to talk about the surge, because that was a huge win for us in Iraq. It looks like things were unraveling in Iraq. And I remember Petraeus was talking about the surge, and it seemed to me it was salesmanship. I'm like, what is going on here? And it ended up being a tremendous victory, and it kind of set up Iraq to, obviously it's going to be an everyday thing. It's never going to be easy, but it put them on a path where the Iraq War could make sense. Talk a little bit about the surge and your role in the surge.
Yeah, it was a very interesting and challenging time. Honored to have been a part of it, but very costly. So my period of time there was 2006 to 2008. When it was all said, said and done, is about 15 months of continuous time. We thought it was going to be 12-month deployment, which we viewed as long at that point in time. The nature of the surge meant those who were in place need to stay, and we need to add more, and they need to stay for 15 months as well. So we have a mass of forces available to operate in multiple areas, putting multiple pressures on the adversaries we're facing, and we're multiple adversaries. So we were doing this in partnership with the Iraqis, building the Iraq security forces, which were widespread. They had a variety of capabilities. And so working with the Iraqis, building their strength, their resolve, and also trying to create room for their political systems, their institutions of government, to begin to knit together. There were some presumptions made when I was at Central Command as the war started, that the Iraqi technocrats, the people who are running the Ministry of Oil and the Ministry of Health and Energy, would be able to resume their work and continue, and they could be put back in place very quickly. But policy got involved, and specifically a policy of de-Baathification. Mm-hmm. This is similar to denazification at the end of World War II, that anyone who was part of the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany could not hold a position of power. So the same thing occurred in Iraq. That policy decision was made to anyone who had been part of the Ba'ath Party could not hold positions of responsibility. That caused all the government institutions to collapse. Because in order to get jobs in a centrally controlled state like that, you have to be part of the party or you can't get a job. So that became an ideological action that had great consequences and opened the door to insurgencies, which burst into full flame in 2004 to 2006. So that fire has been burning now 2 years. Our thought was, from a policy perspective, we would reduce our presence in Iraq, hand more over to the Iraqis, and let them take care of their security. But now you have got this insurgency that's ongoing, with multiple inflamed points and multiple actors participating. To use a sports metaphor, imagine you're playing a game of basketball. You're on the court with your adversary. You look at them at the navel to make sure you know where they're going, and somebody hits you from the stands. And somebody blows up your bus outside of the stadium so that you can't move. You have players who are involved in this that are international and national. So there are various types of Iraqis who were involved in resistance to the Iraqi government and also to the American forces who were supporting the Iraqi government. And they were attacking. There were some who were formed from Al-Qaeda, who we've been after now for several years at that point in time. They had an element operating inside of Iraq. There were some who were from countries that were supporting them. Iran, Russia, China, all were involved in providing support. And we know this from the weapons we picked up and other things that made it very clear that we were not just operating on the court. We were operating beyond the court. In order to establish conditions for success for Iraq, we had to protect the population of Iraq. That's a very different military objective than what we had in 2003 at the outset of the war, which is destroy the Republican Guard forces, destroy the Fedayeen Saddam, topple the Ba'ath regime, and set conditions for stabilization of that country. But very, very different, very different. And so that meant going into neighborhoods, living there, establishing a footprint where Al-Qaeda or the Iran-backed militias had taken over a neighborhood and were now operating attacks from there and holding the population under conditions of terror, murdering school children, leaving them out, not putting them into the ground so that it would send a message that they're not to be messed with. All these things were what we were witnessing during the surge. And we need to be in more places at the same time to do that, specifically to go after the bad guys, but also to protect the population and restore things like services, to make the sewage start flowing again so it's not standing on the street, to get schools built and put kids inside of them, to get the health system up and running so that corpses weren't laying in morgues for months, melting down on each other. All these things are the realities of what I experienced there. And it took a committed effort to do that. There is some salesmanship that has to happen to gain resources, especially when you're in the middle of a pitched fight like the surge was. You can't tell in the middle of that whether you're winning or losing, even when you're winning, which we were. We were winning. There's no doubt about it. But what comes after victory? You don't have a parade and walk away. You have now set conditions for Iraq to have a chance. And how long do you stay with them to deliver that chance? You know, the rest of my career ends up being in the Middle East and then into Asia. And I look at some of the examples of what I experienced in Germany in the Cold War, what I experienced in Korea, what I experienced in Japan, other places I served, where we had been present for more than half a century. And in each of those cases, we begin to rub off and the institutions of government can take root. The population moves in different direction. You get things like K-pop coming out of Korea. It's a direct impact of proximity to U.S. military forces and armed forces radio and television service. These are the rub-offs that happen from a committed presence. We left Iraq too soon. So they had a chance, and then left to their own devices, they went back to their old ways. And then the interference, the players from the stands and from outside of the stadium, then came in a very strong way and skewed the direction that Iraq was going, and even more so in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So this is the reality. Foreign policy, they get to make the decisions to stay or go, to get in or not get in. But once they make that decision, there are consequences to staying. And in my opinion, from my experience, there are greater consequences to leaving.
Yeah. And it's always hard to second guess what's going to happen because you don't know the damage that would happen if your actions were different. But you guys, it was an amazing win for us. I did want to get quickly, and I know I'm over your time now. You know, you retired while you were in command in Korea. As I mentioned earlier, you had 650,000 troops under you. But, you know, recently we've had our first European ground war since World War II, which we probably thought would never happen ever again. as a military man and probably a historian, because you've lived you've lived all these the modern wars. Is the Ukraine war, the Russian-Ukraine war, is it just like a laboratory for us to see what war in the future is going to be, or is this something a one-off where this can never really happen again because the technology it makes these wars too dangerous?
Humans don't get that kind of credit to acknowledge that anything is too dangerous. Humankind is warlike, bickering, argumentative. It also is filled with love and support and advocacy and cooperation. Both poles will continue to exist. Humankind is not going to change. So war is not unconscionable, no matter the degree of danger that emerges from the technologies in the hands of the combatants. They said war is unconscionable in 1958. It's unconscionable because of the atomic age. There will never be war again, especially not ground wars. Hello? You forgot about the humans. Yeah. So humans will either choose to use the atomic weapons or not, but that didn't stop them from fighting with each other.
Yeah.
So this underestimation of the human dimension that can erupt into warfare must never be excluded from the equation, no matter what the technology is, no matter what the era is. Ukraine is not a one-off, and it's both a glimpse of the present and simultaneously a glimpse of the past, as well as a glimpse of the future. It is all the above. And I use that in terms of the glimpse of the present is this fusion of traditional military capabilities and drones being used for precision targeting when you can't afford a joint direct attack munition. So use something else to create a specific tactical effect at a given point in time that is a present technology being used in a way that it wasn't created for or imagined when created. It's also trench warfare. It's also massed artillery attacks a la 1930 to 1948. It's all those. And it's also an allusion to the future with the information domain being used as it is, with accurate information and deliberate disinformation being competitors against one another by the adversaries, with the use of artificial intelligence and technologies associated with that, the depth of the attacks that are occurring, what they go after in terms of displacing the Black Sea Fleet from land, doing it, attacking into the sea spaces. All these things are glimpses of future warfare. That's the way all wars are. And let me just make one adjustment as we talk about this being the first land war in Europe since World War II. Sort of. It's the first state-on-state land war since World War II. And that's really important because it calls into question the role of the state in its own security and in its approach to alliances. And that's what's come into play here. And it's certainly a harbinger of what may come in the future. But it's also, the things that caused me to go to Kosovo were because of ground wars that were happening in the Balkans.
Yeah.
Same thing with Bosnia before that. I didn't operate in Bosnia, but I'm very familiar with what happened in Bosnia and did some operations that were supporting Bosnia. But all these things that happened as the fire continued to burn down through what had been Yugoslavia. That is an example of ground wars that were allusions to future wars. All wars are like that. You ask the question, is it a laboratory? Yes, every war is a laboratory. And trust me, the proving grounds were active. Me and my colleagues in Iraq in my tours of duty there, both during the surge and then coming in a year and a half later and taking over the southern half of Iraq. The proving grounds are, what I mean by this is different players around the world bringing their technologies into a laboratory to find out whether they work or not against advanced systems like the ones the Americans had. Explosively formed penetrators. These are some of the things that the Iranians had imported into Iraq that could penetrate some of our armor that Soviet tanks could not penetrate. And it was much more primitive in how it was done, but it was highly effective and very deadly. that they did the proving grounds in Iraq. They tested it in the field, in use, in combat. And we were doing the same. So we were testing things as well. So that is the nature of warfare. They're always laboratories, proving grounds, and the United States military is learning a lot from what's happening in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. It's learning a lot from what's happening in Israel with the Hamas versus Israel operations in Palestine. Always professionals study and try to perfect their craft.
Yeah. Well, look, this has been great, General. It's an honor to talk to you. I did want to talk a little, just quickly, about some of your favorite projects you've done in retirement. I mean, you've stayed incredibly busy. I mentioned before you're the vice chair of the Gary Sinise Foundation, a principal consultant at West Exec, a visiting fellow. Just talk about some of your passions and things that you've enjoyed most in retirement.
Well, I've been retired for 5 years, and so I'm still trying to figure out where is my passion and what do I want to spend most of the rest of my life doing. And so this is part of the journey, is experiencing all these things. Is it academia and thought leadership? Is it just giving back and mentorship? Is it working in the corporate world as a board director on 3 different publicly traded companies? And the answer is, I enjoy all of those. Okay, so the passion, the passion for me in this stage of life is being with my wife. We've been married for 40 and a half years. And so I want to get as much time as I can with her, because I spent so much time away from her during the previous 40 years. And family genealogical research. I'm deeply into that and learning more and more things, particularly about my Virginia roots and my Virginia connections. And I'm a Virginian. I finally am able to say, when people say, where are you from? Well, I'm an Army brat. But let me stop. My roots are in Virginia. I'm a Virginian. And it's Northern Virginia, from the western edge of Virginia, where it meets West Virginia, in through Loudoun County, Fauquier County, and into Fairfax County, into Alexandria City. That's the swath of where my family's history is for several hundred years. Okay, and we were part of one family that's very well known and well documented, the Quander family. By the way, there's a book out. I got to tell you about this book. I'm gonna put a plug in here. Sure. I'm not the author of the book, but our family story is featured in this book. And if your readers are interested in this, it's worth their while. But it's called Embracing Your Past to Empower Your Future. Embracing Your Past to Empower Your Future. It's available, online if you want to order that. It's really following the story of 4 African-American families from slavery into the modern times. And the Brooks family is one of those 4 stories. The Quander family, which I'm also related to, is one of those stories. And then really fascinating research by an author named Lorianne LaRocco, CNBC news correspondent, and her high school daughter, Abby Wallace. Part of her high school project was to write a book, and she did. The 2 of them wrote a great book.
Yeah, that's amazing. And with online resources and ancestry.com, it's really helpful. I've gotten to it a little bit. I've got some strange found some strange items in my family's past as well. But I guess that's part of it too. You got to be careful.
That's part of being an American.
Yeah, it is. You got to be careful how far you dig. How far you dig. So, General Brooks, I just want to let you know, my father worshipped your dad. I mean, you probably have no idea how close of friends they were, but how much he held your father in esteem. I wish he was around to see this interview. He would just be smiling and just really loving it, because he really loved your father. And again, my mother and your mother also were friends as well. So this is just an honor for me to talk to you. I've admired your career from afar. You're an American hero. You talk about these occasions like they were nothing. This was just part of your life, but it was just amazing that you got to see these things close up. And not only did you get to see them, you were a protagonist, and you had to make big decisions that kept us safer. So I just want to thank you for your service. But your family is truly an historic family. I believe probably the first Black family to have 3 generals in the same family. I would imagine.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
First, and unfortunately only at this point. We're counting on others to take our place, but right now we're the only one. I mean, we've got a cousin. We got a Quander cousin that's 4 generals in the same family.
It's amazing. Also, your sister was a fantastic, is a fantastic lawyer as well. Just an historic family. It's just an inspiration. So anyway, I appreciate you doing this. Maybe,
Thank you, Joe.
I don't know if you live I don't know if you live in Northern Virginia, but I'd love to see you in person one of these days as well.
I'm a Virginian, but I live in Texas.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
this is where my wife's side of the family is, and it's her turn.
Okay. Her turn. But next time you're in town, if you have a free opportunity, love to have a coffee or have a beer or whatever. Yeah, that'd be great.
We can carry on the connections of our families as we should.
We should.
That's the least we can do to honor our fathers.
Yeah, we absolutely should. So anyway, again, General Brooks, this has been great. I appreciate you doing this, and let's keep in touch.
All right, take care and thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, General.